Hi, guys. How's everybody doing? It's pretty legit. It's super full here on a Sunday afternoon, which is something for which I'm very grateful. Folks, quick show of hands just to give me a sense of continuity and meeting y'all where you are. How many of you came to my session last year? That's pretty cool. How many of y'all came to my session 2 years ago? That's super cool. I'm noticing a correlated or causal proximity to stage based on that question. So thank you for coming. Folks, this is my third year speaking at South by Southwest, and I'm deeply grateful for the privilege. 2 years ago, I shared the sort of contrarian and provocative notion that futurists are secretly historians, and that we can make meaning out of all the newfangledness that's coming at us new and next by spending a little more time than you'd think studying our journey to current, right? That we could inoculate ourselves against snake oil and hyperbole by understanding what's happened in the past. Last year, my team and I did a combo sort of exercise wherein we shared the provocative and eyebrow-raising notion that stories are the original information technology, and that fiction is in fact a vehicle for business value, and then beyond that, that science fiction is a Trojan horse for some of today's touchiest subjects and most thoughtful topics. I think this year's thesis continues in this train of maybe walking that line between unexpected and provocative and contrarian, and I'm going to give you a little teaser. And the teaser is, I think expertise is overrated. And I think specifically that in this era where we're finding ourselves so drawn into hyper-specialization, fewer and fewer viable majors for fewer and fewer viable jobs, that the way up and the way out isn't to join that elbows out competition. It's actually to work more broadly and to be a wider thinker. So y'all ready to light this candle with me? Yes, okay. So let's hop into the Wayback Machine, given that futurists are low-key historians, and ask for a show of hands, how many of you remember the 1980s phenomenon Trivial Pursuit? All right, Trivial Pursuit was wild. 9-year-old me would be hanging out with my parents and my best friend Kevin's house with his parents, and we'd be playing this sort of barroom trivia board game before barroom trivia was a thing. And it was a lot of fun, right? Like, you'd pull a card out of a box and people would say, like, who won Best Picture in 1974? And if you knew that, you were something. And then they'd say, yeah, okay, tough guy, but if you want the second cheese, what's the capital of Mozambique? And this game went unexpectedly global viral. Because in 1985, knowing things was a superpower. Knowing things was a sign of high intelligence. Knowing things meant that, to use consulting jargon, you were a high potential high performer. And this archetype, this idea of the know-it-all, was perhaps best represented by a character in a 1980s TV show called Cheers. His name was Cliff Clavin. He was a postman, and he knew lots of stuff about lots of stuff. And for those of a certain age, no description is needed. For the younger half of the room, all you need to know is this is the actor who played the voice in every Pixar movie. He was Mac the truck, he was the abominable snowman, and he was Ham the piggy bank, and like 12 more. And when this cat would say something like, you know, the airspeed of an unladen swallow is 9 meters per second, everybody would listen. Because in 1985, how are you going to argue? Because if you're this guy and you're not buying it, what are your options? You're gonna walk halfway across town, uphill both ways, to the library? You're gonna call up the Encyclopedia Britannica? You're gonna walk the Dewey Decimal System for a half hour to find a book on aviation velocity? Worst case, you're stuck in the basement with something called microfiche. And again, it's hard to describe, but just think of like the deep web analog. No, you're not going to do any of that. And so what you do is you just throw shade at Cliff Clavin. You're like, whatever, man. It's a bar bet. One day we'll learn the answer and we'll settle it, but we probably won't, and so we'll have another beer. Well, here's a scoop. My friend, Dr. Andy Fano, who teaches the MBAI program at Northwestern University, he told me 20 years ago, he said, listen, the internet killed the bar bet. Because by 1995, that slog across town was a slog to your basement. Right? You fire up your Pentium on your 28K modem. Right? You visit yahoo.stanford.edu. And you can find the airspeed of an unladen swallow. 10 years after that, the walk is even shorter. You just walk to your kitchen. You connect to Google over the wireless fidelity radio system on your laptop. 10 years after that, it's a 1-meter trek to your pocket. Anywhere you go, all the time. And today, it's, hey Siri, what's the capital of Mozambique? Maputo.
Mozambique.
Nice. Thanks, comic timing. Work on it, Siri. Here's the thing. There was a Nobel-winning prize economist by the name of Herbert Simon. I remember reading his stuff in the late 1990s, and he said, as information approaches infinity, that which it consumes approaches zero, and what it consumes should be rather obvious. It's the attention of the consumer. And I thought, man, that's wild, because that scientifically explains the behavior of my 12-year-old. Anybody here ever hear a comedian named Des Bishop? Oh, okay, so for the one individual who's pumped about this, he says the reason we didn't need mindfulness training in the 80s because we weren't walking around with cable TV services in our pocket. And he's onto something. Information saturation up here, attention to consume it down here. But there's some other things that approach zero. Namely, the marginal cost of remembering things approaches zero. Right? Why would I need to know stuff when this thing on my wrist, comic timing notwithstanding, knows all the stuff? And moreover, the value or business case of the Cliff Clavin approaches zero. Which is why in our work life, when you're interviewing somebody, you don't say, do you know this? Have you memorized that? Have you mastered this? Right? Self-respecting executives say, no, I want to get a sense of how they think. Because all the answers are less than a meter away. Well, here's the scoop. We've had 30 years to begin to norm to this once heretical idea that computers are better at knowing and remembering things than we are. But we've had less than 3 years to begin to norm to the spooky idea that maybe they're better at thinking about things than we are too. Maybe it's more than just the end of Cliff Clavin. Maybe it's the end of the expert and the maven. Well, what do I mean? Before the ChatGPT moment, I was meeting with one of my clients in Houston. His name's Randy, and Randy works for a hydraulic manufacturing organization. And I remember enthusiastically showing him something that our lab had looked at. It was called a generative pre-trained transformer model. And I said, Randy, check this thing out. Like you could feed it the beginning of a Shakespearean sonnet, and it'll imagine the rest at a quality that would fool a Shakespearean scholar. To which Randy said, and I quote, Mike, we manufacture hydraulic presses. We do not manufacture poems. And so I put it in the oops pile. Sorry, not one of those good futures, never mind. And then I remember about a year later at Christmas, I'm at my Aunt Teresa's house in Evergreen Park, Illinois, southeast side of Chicago, and she's putting sweet potatoes on my plate. She goes, did you hear that robots can paint pictures and write poems now? It's nuts. And I'm channeling my 18-year-old. I go, I am aware. But what clicked for me was that if Aunt Teresa was hip to the robot brains, there was something afoot in broader business and society. And so when Randy, hydraulic Randy, approaches me that spring and he goes, we found this system that, well, take a look. We're feeding it strategic questions and it's feeding us plans for our manufacturing strategy. And I go, Randy, this is the Shakespeare thing. He's like, well, I don't know about that, but what you need to know is that this thing, it's not as good as my best people, but it's better than the rest of them. And I thought, oh boy. Well, for grins and giggles, 2 weeks ago, I reran Randy's query from 2 years ago. And I said, can you make me a full-blown report on this matter? And using a state-of-the-art mixture of experts, frontier-level deep research model, I was asked a series of clarifying questions, including preference for citation style, and presented with a 27-page report reading 17 sources with 35 footnotes, and it did it in 8 minutes. And folks, with love and respect and nothing but adulation for my core team, many of whom are sitting in rows 1 and 2 right now, I think it was better than some of my best people. That's not a roast. It's a recognition that even some of y'all probably not popping that thing out in 8 minutes. So where am I going with this? Well, Gary Kasparov said, anything we can do, and we know how to do it, machines will do it better. They will, not might, not may, will. And why is this interesting? Because Gary Kasparov should know. Gary Kasparov was the first best in-class expert genius to get beaten by a machine at something. 1996, playing chess against IBM Deep Blue. Those of you who were here with me 2 years ago remember my college professor saying, it will never, ever happen. And then it did, because machines could understand the rules. And Kasparov himself conceded and said, whoa, right? Surrender. Now, 15 years later, Ken Jennings loses to IBM again. I don't know what it is with IBM picking fights with us carbon-based life forms. But he loses in Jeopardy. 5 years after that, Lee Sedol loses in the Chinese game of Go. Then I'm talking to a client who's at a law firm, and he says, listen, this thing does case review better than we can, and it's not even close. His quote to me, it's Navy SEALs versus mall cops. A little problematic, but very descriptive. Last week, I was having dinner with two of our dear friends, Dr. and Dr. Patel, Nisha and Biren. They're both radiologists. And Biren says to me, what do you think about this AI business? I says, I think a lot about this AI business. He says, yeah, me too. Nisha and I, we kind of just audit and validate the results of the radiological scans from the AI these days, because at the end of the day, that thing sees patterns better than I could. And I'm thinking to myself, what? Dr. and Dr. Patel are literally our smartest neighbors. They're the family who should have jobs and stuff. And they're worried about this stuff, and I got to thinking oh no, that 2 years ago, I talked about this Tim Urban classic, that it's all funny robot monkey tricks until it blows right past us. And so, pack your boxes and welcome to the end. Okay, any questions? Thanks for coming to my, no. No, 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 no. One of my friends and clients works for a toy company that makes bricks. You can figure it out. Over a beer in Copenhagen, he says, we found this tool which will scan every brick in your pile and show you every conceivable toy you can make. I said, what? Every brick in your pile and every conceivable toy you can make. How many of y'all have kids or have ever been a kid? Right. That every hand didn't go up is a problem, but we'll come back. When you build Legos with your kids, you think you're there to build cool stuff. In truth, my buddy Jesper told me, he says, you're actually there to make lasting memories. But in his own inimitable words, he says, the problem is these pain-in-the-butt little pieces. And, I'm like 2 beers in, so I was just like, you make the pieces, bro. But his punchline was that time spent in that muck is time robbed from the magic. And then, somewhere around round 3, he says, that magic stands on the shoulders of other externalities too. Somebody's got to make the bricks. Somebody's got to drill the oil that goes in the petroleum that makes the bricks. And I'm like, dude, you lost me. And he goes, yeah, well, because you don't think about that because it's below the not my problem line. And I go, oh, we need another round. And what he says is, the reason he loves that app is because it raises the water line so that we spend less time on that muck and can free more precious human cycles for that magic. And I'm thinking, oh, that's good. And so I get together with one of my clients who's the chief product officer at one of the largest banks in North America, and I cannot tell you who they are either. But this guy looks at my picture and he goes, listen, my North Star is not nearly as poetic as making memories. I'm here to make money. But I'll tell you what, I make that money with differentiated products and services. You know what gets in my way? Admin. And you know what gets in that way? Front office software. And you know what gets in that way? These blinky lights in the basement. And if what you're telling me is, in the same way you Deloitte cats could solve problem 1 with the cloud integration and problem 2 with the ERP CRM systems integration, you're telling me this AI business is going to free that time to do more of the good stuff? And I said, yes. And he said, I'm in. And I said, sign here. Now, it begs the question, what about our boy here? I call him Toby. What about Toby? Were any Tobys harmed in this experiment? Well, the skeptic, the cynic would say, yeah, because when the water line raises up, don't need Toby no more. And that's at the existential heart of our dread in this new normal. But remember what that client said. It wasn't about doing today's work with less Tobys. It was about freeing Toby to get busy on the good stuff. Smart businesses realize that you can't shrink your freaking way to success. David Packard of Hewlett-Packard, the guy knew what he was talking about. You can't lean and mean and whittle and efficiency and Six Sigma yourself to growth. It doesn't work like that. Because if you do that, somebody with no business being in your business comes along and they put you out of business. And so what do? What you got to do is you got to get Toby up into the magic. And this is very exciting because Toby's getting a raise in promotion. He's got a better haircut. He's wearing a quarter zip. He's whiteboarding. He's a thought leader. But it's right here where skeptics and cynics and Anchorman's Ron Burgundy would say in his inimitable way, I don't believe you. Why? Because the question remains, can Toby swim? The only way this works is if humans float, or can swim, or can somehow otherwise figure out how to move along with the AI waterline. Well, 5 years ago, my team and I wrote a report, the old-fashioned way, where we talked to over 400 leaders of innovation programs at leading corporations and governments around North America. Our goal was to figure out what separated folks who could reliably elevate, who could reliably change muck for magic, from people who could only do it in fits and starts and would get stuck a lot and throw in the towel and say, business as usual. And some of the things we learned in that work, thing one, companies that lead with need, companies that have a clear North Star, whether it's making memories or making money, have a better time. Because regardless of the changes in the waterline, they have a North Star. But thing two that we learned that organizations with a knack for this stuff tend to have stories like this. We talked to some leaders at Johns Hopkins. They said in 1957, when the Soviet Union put Sputnik up into the air, their astrophysics team at Johns Hopkins got busy realizing that the same techniques they used for Doppler shift on stars, celestial bodies, moons, could be applied to little Sputnik. And they were talking about it at lunchtime at Johns Hopkins. And the table next to them was full of a totally different team. Not the astrophysicists, the radio engineer people. And the radio engineer people, they go, what's this now, something satellite? They're like, yeah, we found this way to measure the velocity of this satellite that the Russians put up. And the radio guys go, you know what, we've got some math from our lab that could do one better. We've got this triangulation thing cooking that allows us to actually understand the derivative of the velocity, aka the position. And then the astrophysicists played their Uno reverse card, and they were like, if you can figure out their position, I bet we can figure out our position. And that little baby was called GPS. And it wouldn't happen unless lunchroom eavesdropping was afoot. Now, fast forward, capacitive touchscreens on our smartphones, right? Neuroscientists understanding the exact electrical output of the human mind, and then the kind of proximal output from human fingers, get to talking with a completely different cast of characters who are doing electrical engineering and trying to figure out how to make the buttons on an old-fashioned chiclet phone require less pressure. And then whoomph, they had a beautiful little baby called the capacitive touchscreen, and the basis for the smartphone was born. Now, it doesn't always have to be engineering fanciness. When I used to be a venture capitalist, I remember talking to a startup, and this guy was so chill, and he was one of my favorite entrepreneurs ever. And he goes, yeah, so drones aren't new, and like first aid kits are totally not new. But we like strapped first aid kits to drones, and it's raining money. I was like, I guess I'll sign here. But the idea being, it wasn't new to world, it was a new mashup of knowns. An unexpected collision of unusual suspects that resulted in money through that cross-disciplinary creative cross-pollination. Now, this doesn't just happen in business and science, it happens in show business. How many of y'all saw Hamilton? Right? History, hip-hop, Who knew? Global phenomenon, right? I talked to a guy here at South by Southwest 2 years ago. He says, you'll never believe how we pitched Eisner on The Lion King. I'm like, do tell. He goes, Hamlet with animals. Not incorrect. The punchline is this. This ain't a half-bad way to think about what we're dealing with right now, but I think we can do better. And I think the recognition is we are the heroes we're looking for. The water isn't coming to get us. The water has always been there, and it's our job, and critically has always been our job, to build a higher ladder. And how do you build higher heights? You need a broader base. And folks, what we started to see as we put this research together and as I began to obsess about today's remarks was that cross-disciplinary breadth isn't this new AI-fueled madness. It's always been the jam. Alexis Carrel, the father of the vascular surgery and the modern organ transplant, he was the first person to figure out how to sew flesh together in a way where it would hold and the body wouldn't reject it. And in his memoir, he credited the techniques to summers spent in France with his grandmother who would teach him embroidery. Embroidery plus medicine, save a couple 100 million lives. Sign me up. Johann Gutenberg, the printing press. 500 years ago, what's that all about? Well, it turns out our boy Yo here lived in a region of Germany that made wine. And their whole superpower was pressing the Rhine with this sort of screw-based mechanism. But it turned out that he also hung out socially with a group of bankers who pressed coins. And it occurred to him that if he used the wine press thing with the coin stamping thing and traded red tannins for ink, he could make the printing press, and he did. My dad, speaking of printing, studied typesetting in vocational school at Chicago Vocational School, CVS. Anytime he'd mention it, it always was followed by, you know, I went to school with Dick Buckus. I was just like, I am aware. He would talk to me about how in the typesetting printing room, static electricity is the foe. The foe of all foes, because if you touch something just the wrong way, drag your foot, and the toner particles fly everywhere and you got to restart. And so as I'm reading a biography of Benjamin freaking Franklin, he talks in the middle of the book about how Franklin had the same problem in his printing press. He built this little doodad that would soak up the sort of residual electrostatic energy. And then he realized that if he built a big honking one and stuck it on a roof, that you could protect homes from lightning. And that's the real, Ben Franklin discovered electricity. No, Ben Franklin figured out how to take a printer technique, scale it up, and make a fortune creating the first home reinsurance business. Anybody here know the story of Hedy Lamarr? It's so good. Hedy Lamarr was a glamorous Hollywood actress in the late 30s and early 40s, at least to 99.9% of Gen Pop. That's all we knew. But it turns out Hedy Lamarr's superpower was actually engineering, mathematics, and a weird arcane understanding of player pianos. And so when she wasn't literally starring in films, she partnered with a small team of engineers to build frequency hopping spread spectrum radio frequencies, which became the basis for cryptography and wireless communications over the next 50 years. When she wasn't starring in movies, which is wild. And I think whether you go back to the original polymath, Ibn Sina, in West we call him Avicenna. He was the Persian polymath, year 1000, takes metaphysics, physics, philosophy, mathematics, and biology and creates the canon, or the canon of medicine, or you go to sort of the father of all polymaths, our main man, Leonardo da Vinci. The pattern is clear. Folks who connect broad, or better still, disparate disciplines, they don't just make leaps, they make freaking quantum leaps. And it's not a new AI story, it's the story. There's this great book by Franz Johansson called The Medici Effect. Highly recommend. He says, listen, Da Vinci believed that the only way to properly understand a problem was to understand it from at least 3 disparate perspectives. My friend Mike Maddock, my old business partner, used to say this with a little bit of down-home Appalachian wisdom. He would say, Mike, you can't read the label when you're stuck inside the jar. And there's not a week goes by where I don't bother my team with this quote, because it's the stuff, and it's at the very essence of today's thesis. Because as we combine domain A to domain B to create domain C, some other cat is mixing up X and Y to get to Z. And then you get those people together in a lunchroom, and they cook up more, and everybody keeps cooking up more. And the point is this: the entire history of human technology-based, scientific-based, business-based innovation is a wild story of ladders all the way up. And one of the things I learned was that there's actually a mathematical principle behind this called the Sierpinski triangle. And after your eyes refocus, look to the bottom left and follow 2 triangles begetting 1, which becomes the base for another, and another, and another, and another, ad infinitum, forever. And it was my recognition about 2 months ago that the water line is still. We're the ones moving. It's a relativistic frame of reference issue. And just when you think that your arcane mastery of calligraphy will set you apart, you're like, oh no, I'm lower left corner, nothing. And then you come over here, you're like, I know, I'll learn Python. Oh no, I'm lower left corner, nothing. You're like, wait a minute, I'll actually learn public speaking. That'll be fine. The thing is, gang, we're at the very crux of my thesis. And it goes like this. The future favors dot connectors over dot perfectors. Dot connectors are going to have a better time. They always have. Because the fact of the matter is, arcane mastery of anything to an AI is just perfecting calligraphy. What are you doing? If you're not going up, you're going nowhere. And the best way up is to go out. Team, specialization has been a reliable path to reaching par with best practices. Cross-pollination is the key to creating next practices. And as we worry about the musical chairs game of which of these ever-diminishing number of majors should my kid major in, the answer is all of them and none at all, because it's up and away, not hunkering down. And it ain't new. We talked about memory in minds. We've had 300 years to get used to the idea that we ain't terribly well positioned against a steam engine at anything. But we grew up with it. It's normal, so it's not provocative and crazy, right? The industrial age taught us that. It taught our grandparents and their grandparents that. No biggie, right? Before that, we had the agrarian age. And that was presumed too, but I'm assuring you, each of these transitions was a freak out when they took place. And the derivative, kind of recursive takeaway here is that just as agrarian experts force multiplied the productivity of the planet, So too did industrial experts force multiply the productivity of the farmers. And then the IT crowd came in and they force multiplied the productivity of the industrialists. And here comes the AI crowd force multiplying the productivity of the IT crowd. And it begs the question, what are we going to do? The derivative here, in the same way that position begets velocity, begets acceleration, begets jerk, is that industry begets information, begets intelligence, begets ingenuity. Ingenuity is where our and our kids' fortunes stand to be made. That's the next word in the puzzle. And what I'd like to use our next, call it 10, 12 minutes hitting, are some pro tips for just that. Pro tips for polymathy, call to action, things you can do so this doesn't feel like a talk, it feels like the beginning of your walk. You Ted Lasso people in the room. Ish, okay. This great scene where Ted Lasso's like having his comeuppance against the big baddie, and he's throwing darts. He's like, people underestimate me my whole life. It's because they were insufficiently curious about me. Then he gets like a billion-point dart round. I don't know darts too well. But his big takeaway is that curiosity is king. And I would tell you, yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, be a lifelong learner. But I don't think curiosity is enough. I think intellectual curiosity is table stakes. Y'all ready for a spicy take? To the chagrin of my PR team. I think you want to be intellectually promiscuous. I think you want to snuggle with as many ideas as you can get your hands on. I think you want to find anything and everything you can to study and learn, because in a world where that AI waterline is coming up asymptotically, you've got to be even wider. Now, there's this idea called quadratic graph theory that says that the number of connections between things grows quadratically with the number of things you learn, which is a way of saying if you know 2 things, you got 1 thing, right? But if you know 10 things, goodness gracious, you know 45 different things. My experience with college football ranking algorithms reminds me of a problem I once saw in the cultivation of vegetables in Peru. Really? Yeah. Because as this grows, and here's a visualization of it, you realize that polymathy is intelligence. This is what you want to inculcate. This is why you want to keep learning things. In fact, I learned how to code that graphic by having an interesting conversation with a large language model saying, help me learn Python and code this thing, and there's that thing. And I didn't know how to do that 4 days ago. And yes, I'm admitting that that graphic's only 4 days old. 2, train your brain. My teammate Raquel dubbed this man Mr. Squiggles. I kind of want him on a shirt. But the idea works like this. It's one thing to collect a bunch of dots, but it's a different thing to learn the skill of connecting them. And the way you do that, first things first, it's a lot like working out. It turns out that right around 5 hours a week spent training in a new subject is the Pareto optimal. There's research on this. Because if you spend 40 hours a week doing it, you end up becoming an expert there. And as we said, expertise can be a problem because it locks you in a new jar and it causes something called cognitive entrenchment. Yes, there's such a thing as too knowledgeable. Don't let that happen. What you want, if any of y'all are workout people, you want muscle confusion. You want enough time in the new area to get conversant, but not so much that you become a weird guardian of orthodoxy. Another important part to training your brain is you need play. You need play. That quote, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, that quote comes from a place of uninteresting. Like, wow, he's the worst cocktail discussion ever. He keeps talking about banking or something. Banking, banking, banking. Contrast that with somebody who's just like, yeah, so when I was like paragliding the other day, learning how to curate vegetables in Peru, like, whoa, right? Because without hobbies, you're actually not being as smart. I used to find in my old research lab, there was this crazy correlation between people who played musical instruments and thrived in our technical research lab. Why? Because music is patterns and relationships and spatial and the whole thing. 20 years later, I'm convinced that's causal, not correlative. So play. And then also rest. None of this rise and grind hustle culture stuff. Pick something worth your time and then allow for what's called memory consolidation at nighttime, right? To fuse the connections in your noggin. Because if you don't, you won't. And it matters. 3, you want to engineer serendipity. This was fun. I asked this image diffusion model, I was like, give me the most unexpected collision of usual suspects. And it came back so excited, just like, okay, we're going to have bankers, musicians, forest animals, and snowmen. It's like, thanks, robot brain. You want that in your professional life. If you're surrounded by the aforementioned bankers, spend time with some poets. If you're surrounded by poets, give a banker a try. Because that collision, as my old friend Saul Kaplan at the Business Innovation Factory at the Trinity Rep Theater in Providence, Rhode Island said best, unexpected collisions of unusual suspects is where sparks fly, magic happens, and money is made. If you want to go expert mode, you build your whole freaking career around serendipity. In last year's talk, I regaled / bored you to tears with my journey from anthropology, political science, philosophy, into development, inventor, investor, not-for-profit operator, futurist, professor. And I don't share that as a boast. I was as confused as anybody as I was walking through that wind. But I'll tell you what, one way to get out of the jar is to make sure you forcibly, proactively spend time in more jars. So if you ever feel like the ratio of learning and earning in your current role is a little dubious, it's time to go. Because the data says that you'll be asked to go either way. Number of jobs that you'll likely have in a career, actively or passively, is up to 14 now. So call the shot. Don't be a leaf in the wind. Adjust your own freaking sails. 4, be real, be you. Oscar Wilde said it best. He said, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. That's so good. He also said, anybody ever hear imitation is the sincerest form of flattery? Do you know the full quote? It's savage. He says, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery mediocrity can pay to greatness. He's a humble guy. But what he was basically saying was that nobody wants a cover band, especially an AI algorithm. Because anybody here ever talk about, like in one of your seminars, maybe this year or at this conference, like how like AI is all about the data. It's all about the data. Bring new data. If you're walking through life like an NPC, that water line's coming in hot for you. If you're walking through life like Oscar freaking Wilde, making stuff every gosh darn day, you're gonna have a better time. Because you've got fresh data. Little moment of openness with y'all. I have multiple sclerosis. And I'm open with it. And those who are friends and colleagues know this about me. And I remember in 2017 when I was diagnosed, I was like, am I going to die? And they says, no, not no. And I said, well, what's going to happen? They're like, well, your mind could change, your body could change, but I says, what do you mean? And they said, well, have you ever been accused of having nonlinear thinking? I was like, yeah, I've built a career on it. And it occurred to me, that that deficit was a strength. Because it turns out in MS, the plaques formed by the myelin sheath repair creates these little detours. And so when I'm thinking about A to B, I can't help but make a detour at Z. And so use your bugs as features, because back to the AI NPC problem, you're going to want to bring authenticity above all else. Any students in the room? Anybody have students? Good. Henry David Thoreau, never let your schooling interfere with your education. You're going to be shepherded towards picking something. My son is just like, what are you going to be? Business analytics or finance? Figure it out. You're 18. Life's short. It's like, what? Resist the siren call of specialization. I just joined a board last week at Notre Dame, my alma mater, and where I teach, called Beyond the Dome. It's focused on intersectional integration between the humanities and between the humanities, the arts, science, and engineering. That's the stuff. Because, gang, my son Brady, when he was doing his college essays last year, I remember I choked up. He wrote, I think I want to do the kind of stuff my dad and his team do, but deep down I know that what I really want is to prepare for jobs that don't exist yet. And it got me thinking, because of my plumbing, it's like that reminds me of options trading, derivatives. You want options contracts, option but not obligation. That's the energy we're looking for. And I think that's what I'd encourage your students to embrace. For leaders, I think you want to recognize that you got some people in your organizations who are I-shaped skill sets. They do one thing, they do it deeply, they're specialists, and there's no shame in that game. But if you can turn the I's into T's, AKA, yes, you're accounts payable and we need you and thank you, but can you learn these other things? What you'll find is you begin to create that versatility and that ability for them to start building ladders. For the people who are already T's, turn them into what some people call X's, which is to make it part of their job responsibility to proactively integrate and involve others. Right? A bunch of T's, tippy finger to tippy finger, is one thing. A bunch of X's tightly collaborated, that's the GPS story. Right? That's the capacitive touchscreen story. That's the freaking future. The other thing you want to do is you want to foster cognitive, cultural, and experiential mashups, which is to say, you got pioneering dreamers, put them on a team with a grumpy guardian. You got math people, throw them in with the English people. You got Peruvian vegetable experts, you get those people together with the mountain climbers, right? And the benefits aren't just sort of optical. They're not just sort of virtuous, though both are true. The benefits are more breadth equals greater heights. We've been through that. Another thing I'd say, invent, invest, and partner like a polymath, right? Hashtag not a commercial. But Deloitte goes to market this way because we realize that if we show up with an insurance software application, it's us and every other schmo, right? But if we show up with, no, we're going to call it Converge Prosperity, because it's a recognition that if you don't have the health stuff and the wealth stuff, the insurance, the reinsurance, the wealth management, and the asset management together in something holistic and progressive, it's not worth your time. Landing the plane here for everybody, automate yourself so that you can elevate. Folks, I do not have the ability to draw Mr. Squiggles, but my robot buddy did. As I was putting this outline together and obsessing over it, I realized that somewhere between the mayhem of 65 unconsidered pictures and a $65,000 favor from a friend, I could write that simple constitutional prompt on the left that says, and I'll read it to you, I'd like pictures rendered in this presentation to share a common visual aesthetic, namely an 8-bit graphic sensibility, stemming from my youth fandom of adventure games like King's Quest and Sierra Space Quest. How about a cyan and cobalt blue color palette reminiscent of a Commodore 64 home screen? Freedom to use other colors that pop, but mostly the blue tones. 16 by 9 for my slides. All pictures to feature a cute, sprightly protagonist in the mix. Someone to identify with and even cheer for, oh, Mr. Squiggles. And no text, I'll add that later. Folks, as I said the last 2 years, tech isn't the hero or the villain. It's rocket fuel for elevated ambitions, and so have them. Dream big, go big, and if you're thinking I'm too busy for that, then automate the parts you can. It's been an absolute freaking privilege to jam, and now we have 10 minutes for questions. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you. Woo! That was fun. That was fun. We're going to do questions on Slido, and here they are. And if you have any that you want to shout, because we're recording and stuff, if you can put them in Slido, that helps everybody. Deanna, am I free to rock and roll here? Okay. If you had to design an ideal curriculum for the next generation of workers, what subjects or skills would be non-negotiable? Ho, ho, ho. I would start with the classics, both the Western and the Eastern classics. So those of you familiar with, quote, great books programs, PLS at my university is called, Program of Liberal Studies, that walk you from like pre-Socratic thought all the way through like Dark Ages, Middle Ages, Reformation, Renaissance, all that. I think that history of Western thought is money. I also think history of Eastern thought, Confucianism, Buddhism, Taoism, and all that, I think those create the basis for critical thought. Then I would layer in enough math and logic to be dangerous. Who here had a teacher back in high school who said, you're never always going to have a calculator with you? Take that, Mrs. Danielewicz. I think being conversant enough to ask the right questions of the magical math machines is important. I think the point is, you want to make sure in a curricular formation that people aren't what I used to call in my Roman Catholic faith tradition, hollow chocolate bunnies. At Easter, sometimes you'd bite into the bunny and it was air, right? It's not lost on me that the risk of this worldview is that those ladders become a house of cards and nobody's got firm foundations. And so I think it's not as simple as no phones till you're 20, but I would tell you that a move away from STEM hyperspecialization and back to the arts, the humanities, and logic, I think that's coming, and I'm already seeing it. That's why I joined that board. Many industries still prioritize credentials over adaptability. How do companies need to change talent development strategies to truly embrace this mindset? I think outcome-based measurements, like the last word I intended to use in today's remarks was KPIs. But I think if our key performance indicators are tied to clear North Stars, right? Be it making memories or making money, right? Then I think what you can do is you can trace that back into the activities and outcomes of your people. And if you can demonstrate to a thoughtful, data-driven leader that this rectangular certification from this school doesn't seem to correlate with our North Star boss, let's hire different, then your boss starts to not only come around to it, but is filled with joy when he realizes that those people can sometimes prove to be more affordable and happier to be there. It feels like the future is coming faster and faster. Is that true? Whew. So like 3,330 and 3, like that. So that's a thing. It is coming faster. Alvin Toffler, who some believe is the OG futurist, he wrote a book called Future Shock like 40 years ago. he talked about this idea that because of the exponential nature of innovations, everybody here knows Moore's Law, right? The reason Moore's Law, computer chips get twice as good and half the price every 18 months. Not a lot of people double click, why? It's because the machine that printed the little miracle, the next year the little miracle prints an even littler miracle. And 18 months later, the little grandbaby miracle produces a great-grandbaby little miracle. And so what you end up with is this exponent. Okay? That's why the future feels like it's coming faster and is. And frankly, it's the reason why I believe so loudly and proudly in well-roundedness, firm handshakes, eye contact, and being a human, right? Don't bring humans to a robot fight. And what I mean by that is, like, it's clear there's some things that are better for our silicon colleagues. Let them have it, right? We want to focus on the stuff that's unique to us. Per last year's remark, ingenuity, empathy, and initiative, that continues to be our bag. These are great. Thank you for all the questions. There's like 30 questions. How do organizations avoid the risk of idea dilution when encouraging cross-disciplinary thinking? Love it. Lead with need. Before you get to an ideation, how many of you have been in an organization that's had like an idea suggestion box? Burn that thing with fire. And it doesn't mean ideas don't matter. It's that if I've learned anything in my 25 plus years of geek to geezer, it's that you need to start with problems worth solving, issues. Throw out the ideation box, replace it with an issue box. The issue box creates the basis for prioritized needs. And what you'll find is some of them are profound and some of them are profane. Right? People are going to be like, we need a higher return on invested capital approach to talent management. Other people are going to be like, we need to fix the toilet. And both might be true. But what you'll find is if you unleash the polymathy, cross-disciplinary problem-solving teams on those prioritized targets, then even wasted time isn't. Right? Because you're focusing your firepower on itches worth scratching. When hiring someone, what can you ask them to know whether they want to be an adaptable Toby instead of a specialized Toby? Oh boy. Sam Altman, before he was world famous Sam Altman, was just this guy I met at Y Combinator one day. And I remember he was talking about you hire for values, ability to learn, and experience in that order. And his argument was that values ensure that the North Stars are ultimately aligned. Ability to learn assures, as you call it, adaptable Toby, right? And then what they happen to know, it's just like a head start. And so I think there's this quote, great minds discuss ideas, average minds events, other minds people. Talk with people about ideas, and if they sit up in their chair and they love it, you got a live one. If they're like, I thought we were here to discuss my credentials, then you don't. How do we ensure that kids grow up with a sufficient understanding of the basics? We kind of hit it. Thank you, Bree Henley. Where's Bree Henley? I do think quality time, it's quality time. I wish I had, I don't want to end with a wiggly answer to this, but what I find is that you could be all Pareto optimal, super tuned and pruned curricular with a kid, right? Or you could just spend time jamming. Remember the attention economics thing? We're all so busy. Everybody's so busy. Remember the song Cats in the Cradle, right? Like, too busy to play ball and then you turn into that. I think time is going to be the biggest luxury going forward in this future shock world. And so invest that time, I think, with young people, and good things happen. That's all she wrote, folks. Thanks for hanging.